I took a sip of my coffee and nearly choked when I read the letter. It wasn't a bill, wasn't a tax notice, no. It was something far worse, according to the pristine official-looking document. My 50-acre ranch, the same land my grandfather had broken his back, working the same land I had poured my blood, sweat, and beer money into, was no longer mine. At least not entirely. The Homeowners Association, a group I had never been part of, had decided without my knowledge or consent that my ranch was now designated as community land for the entire neighborhood. I squinted at the words, reread them, and then did the only logical thing. I laughed hard, but the laughter died when I got to the part that said effective immediately all fences, barriers, or private property signage must be removed in accordance with HOA guidelines. That was when my coffee mug met the floor, shattering into 100 pieces. A creeping hot rage curled in my chest. These people were actually serious. They were trying to steal my land. An hour later, I stood at the front gate as a tan sedan with a ridiculous HOA logo on the side rolled up my driveway like it owned the place. The door opened and out stepped Margaret Dawson, a middle-aged woman with a round figure squeezed into a blazer, 3 sizes too small. She adjusted her clipboard and strutted up to me with the kind of confidence only people who had never been punched in the face had behind her. 2 other HO board members, equally smug, equally overdressed, hovered like vultures over a fresh carcass. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice syrupy with fake politeness. "We sent you the notice regarding the community land designation we'd like to discuss." The next steps, I folded my arms and stared at her, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Next steps," I finally said. "Yeah, I got a next step. It's called trespassing laws." Margaret let out a small chuckle, the kind that said she found me amusingly stupid. "I think there's a misunderstanding," she said. "You see, our board voted unanimously to include your land within the Hui jurisdiction, since your ranch has historically been accessible to community members for hiking and leisure." Historically, I cut her off. "The only thing this land has historically been used for is ranching, and my land isn't part of your HOA. Margaret gave me a patronizing smile. "It is now." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. None came. She actually believed this nonsense. I looked at the 2 board members behind her, both nodding along like well-trained parrots, and felt a sudden urge to throw something instead. I exhaled through my nose and forced my voice to stay even. "Let me get this straight," I said. "You people who don't own a single blade of grass on this land held a little vote and decided my private property belongs to you." Margaret tilted her head as if explaining something to a particularly slow child. "Not to us, Mr. Monroe, to the community." I was still processing the absolute insanity of this when a silver SUV came rolling up my driveway. The doors popped open and out spilled a family of 4. 2 parents, 2 kids, and a golden retriever. They set off towards my pasture, like they were at a public park. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" I shouted, marching toward them. "What do you think you're doing?" The dad, a balding man in a golf shirt, smiled at me like I was the one intruding. "Oh," Margaret said, "the HOA opened up this land for public use," he said, tossing a frisbee to his son. "Figured we'd check it out." Margaret, who had followed me, placed a firm hand on my shoulder, as if we were old friends. "Jack, this is exactly what we were talking about. Community members enjoying their space." I shrugged her hand off and turned back to the family. "This isn't your space, this is my land." The wife looked at me puzzled, but the Hui said, "I don't give a damn what the Who said," I growled. "Get off my property." The husband frowned. "No need to be rude, buddy." I was about to inform him that he was about 3 seconds from getting his golf shoes filled with manure when another car pulled up, followed by another. More people were arriving, picnic baskets in hand, like I had personally invited them for a neighborhood cookout. My ranch was being invaded in real time, and I felt like I was trapped in some bizarre nightmare. I turned back to Margaret, my patience officially gone. "Get these people off my land now." Her eyes widened in mock innocence. "Oh, Jack, there's no need for hostility. This transition will be easier if we all work together." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Margaret, I swear on my granddaddy's grave, if you don't get off my property, I will personally escort you down the driveway with a garden hose." That finally got a reaction. Margaret's smugness faltered for half a second before she recovered. "Well," she sniffed, adjusting her blazer, "I suppose we'll have to escalate this matter." She turned on her heel and stormed back to her car, her lackey scuttling after her. The trespassers, realizing something was off, started shuffling back to their vehicles as Margaret got into her sedan. She gave me one last look. "You'll be hearing from our lawyer." I grinned. "Slow low, and mean you'll be hearing from my shotgun the moment they were gone." I grabbed my phone and dialed Curtis McGraw, my lawyer. Curtis wasn't just a lawyer. He was the kind of guy who made a living off crushing overreaching HOAs. He answered on the first ring. "Curtis." I said, "I've got a situation." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in his office explaining everything. Curtis listened, nodding along occasionally, scribbling note. When I finished, he leaned back, chewing on the end of his pen. "Ah, the classic Hui land grab," he said, sighing like a man who had seen too much. "They don't actually have legal grounds, but they're banking on you rolling over." I frowned. "So how do I stop them?" Curtis smirked. "You don't just stop them, you fight dirty." I leaned forward. "I'm listening." Curtis tapped his fingers against the desk. "First thing you do is make it impossible for them to use the land. You need deterrence. Fences, signs, security systems." "The work's already got fences," I muttered. "Not that they care then." "Electrify them," Curtis said with a wicked grin, "and make sure it's perfectly legal." I sat back, considering the idea. It was crazy, it was extreme, and I loved it. I spent the next morning at the county records office digging through every legal document I could find on the hose jurisdiction, as expected. My land was never part of their territory, never signed over, and certainly never up for public use. But that didn't stop Margaret Dawson from trying to rewrite reality. She had filed paperwork claiming an annexation of my property into the HOA, citing some obscure community development clause. It was complete nonsense, but it was nonsense that could cost me everything. If I didn't fight back, that same afternoon, I marched into the HOA's office, which was a stuffy little building attached to the community clubhouse. Margaret sat behind a desk, shuffling through paperwork, looking as smug as ever. She barely glanced up when I walked in. "Jack," she said in that syrupy voice that made my skin crawl, "I assume you're here to discuss compliance with the new regulations." I slapped a folder onto her desk. "Actually, I'm here to give you a bill." Margaret arched an eyebrow and opened the folder inside. Were the official documents confirming that my land had never been under HOA jurisdiction until they decided to annex it. And since they claimed my property was now part of the association, that meant they owed me specifically. They owed me 20 years' worth of unpaid HOA dues for the land they had supposedly managed. The number I wrote down was just over $200,000. Margaret's face turned a shade of pale. "I hadn't thought possible this is absurd." "No. What's absurd is you thinking you could steal my land," I said. "So here's the deal. Either the HOA pays me everything they owe, or we take this fight to court, where a judge is going to have a field day with your fraudulent land grab." Margaret's lips tightened. "The board will never agree to this. Then I suggest you find way to make them." I said, "Oh, and one more thing until this is settled. I'll be making a few modifications to my property." I walked out before she could argue. By the time the sun set, I had ordered enough fencing material to make Alcatraz look like a playground. The next morning, I got to work. The first thing I did was reinforce my fences with industrial-grade wiring. Then, I installed a state-of-the-art security system, motion sensors, floodlights, cameras, the whole 9 yards. But the best part, the electric fencing, nothing lethal. Of course, Just enough voltage to send a firm message to any would-be trespassers by noon. Word had spread that I wasn't backing down. Curious neighbors gathered at the edges of my property, whispering among themselves. Some looked concerned, others amused. Margaret, however, was furious. She stormed up to my gate, flanked by two Ho board members and a clipboard clutched in her fist. "This is a clear violation of Ho regulations," she ceded. "Funny," I said, leaning casually against the fence. "I don't remember agreeing to any HOA regulations," she huffed, flipping through her paperwork. "Electric fences are dangerous, so is trespassing," I said. "But since you and your little club are so determined to claim my land, I figured I'd make it more community-friendly." Margaret's eyes darted to the massive LED sign I had installed near the entrance of my ranch. In bright, flashing letters it read, "Warning, trespassers will be zapped." "You're out of control," she said, voice shaking with frustration. "Huh?" "I'm just warming up," I replied. That weekend, the HOA decided to test my patience in the most ridiculous way possible. They organized a massive community picnic on my land. I wasn't even surprised when I saw dozens of people setting up folding chairs, blankets and grills right in the middle of my pasture. Kids ran around with kites, dogs chased frisbees, and someone even had the nerve to set up a volleyball net. It was as if my land had officially become a public park overnight. I watched from my porch, sipping on a cold beer, waiting for the inevitable. Sure enough, it didn't take long. One overly eager jogger, headphones in, oblivious to the world, ran straight into the electric fence. There was a loud crackle, a yelp, and then a very ungraceful stumble backward a few feet away. A group of kids playing soccer kicked their ball right into the fence, and when one of them tried to retrieve it, he got a nice little zap that sent him yelping back to his parents. Screams, confusion, chaos. It was glorious. Margaret was the first to recover. She stormed through the crowd, red-faced and livid. "This is illegal," she shrieked. "No, it's not," I called back. "I checked perfectly within county regulations, non-lethal too. Wouldn't want anyone getting seriously hurt. Just a friendly reminder to stay off private property." "You're a menace," she spat. "No, I am a landowner. I corrected something you seem to have trouble understanding." Margaret's face twisted into something truly ugly. "This isn't over," she hissed, before storming off the next day. I received an official cease and desist letter from the HOA demanding that I take down the electric fences and remove all deterrents. I forwarded the letter to Curtis, who practically cackled when he read it. "They really think they can bully you into giving up?" He said, "Oh, this is getting fun." He drafted a counter-demand stating that if the HOI continued to claim my land as community property, then they were financially responsible for its upkeep. That meant paying for fencing, security, liability insurance, and, of course, back taxes. By the time the numbers were crunched, the HO owed me so much money, they'd have to start charging every homeowner triple just to cover the costs. Margaret's response came in the form of a desperate emergency meeting with the HOA board. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be word spread fast. Homeowners were furious when they found out that their fees were about to skyrocket. It all because Margaret had overstepped her authority. People who had once sung her praises were now calling for her resignation 2 days later. I found Margaret at my gate, again, looking far less confident than before. She cleared her throat, gripping her clipboard, like a lifeline. "Mr. Monroe." She started, her voice strained. "The board has reconsidered its stance. We are willing to discuss a peaceful resolution." I grinned. "I'm listening." She swallowed hard. "If you agree to remove the fences, we'll drop all HOA claims on your land." I took a long, dramatic sip of my coffee. Tempting. "But here's the thing, Margaret. I like my fences and I really like watching you squirm." Her face tightened. "This is extortion. No, this is justice. I said you tried to steal my land, you lost. And now you're going to do exactly what I say." Margaret stared at me for a long moment, jaw clenched before finally nodding. "Fine. The board will vote to officially remove your land from the HOA." That's a good start, I said. And one more thing. You're going to cover my legal fees. Her nostrils flared. You can't be serious. I crossed my arms. Oh, I'm dead serious. Silence stretched between us. Then, with visible effort, she gave a stiff nod. Fine. I smiled, watching as she turned on her heel and walked away. The war wasn't over yet, but I had won the battle and I wasn't done making them pay. Margaret's defeat should have been the end of it. But I knew better. People like her didn't just roll over and accept failure. They plotted, schemed, and looked for any possible loophole to claw their way back to power. So I stayed ready. I reinforced my fences, added even more security cameras, and made sure my lawyer was on standby for whatever nonsense they tried next. But to my surprise, things stayed quiet, too quiet. Then, about a week later, I started to see some weird stuff. Guys in suits, none of whom I knew, were pacing the neighborhood, muttering quietly to several members of the HOA board. Some residents in town began not waving at me, and when I caught them staring, they would look decidedly nervous. It wasn't long before the word spread like wildfire. The HOA was in full-blown crisis mode. Householders were outraged over the special assessment charges Margaret had attempted to impose on them, and a petition had already started circulating calling for her resignation. It all came to a head at the next HOA meeting. Now, I wouldn't normally waste my time sitting in on one of their little neighborhood cult gatherings, but this time was different. This time, they were debating whether or not Margaret should stay in charge, and there was no way I was going to miss that. I got there early, took a seat towards the back of the room, arms crossed, and quietly observed as the pandemonium unfolded. The tension was palpable the moment Margaret walked into the room. She sat at the front as always, but for the very first time there was no smirk on her face, no air of superiority. Instead, a frantically suppressed fear. A gray-haired man named Mr. Wills stood up first. He'd lived in the neighborhood for decades and had been one of Margaret's strongest supporters. But tonight, his face was raw anger. "We've had enough," he announced, his voice shaking with anger. "Under your leadership, Margaret, this HOA has gone from a simple community organization to a full-on dictatorship. You've overstepped, cost us thousands, and nearly got us dragged into a lawsuit." Murmurs of agreement echoed through the room. Margaret opened her mouth to defend herself, but another homeowner jumped in before she could get a word out. "You informed us that Monroe's property was legally under the HOA," a woman snarled. "You lied. And now my family's paying an additional $5,000 in fees this year. Are you going to pay me back, Margaret?" Margaret's face grew red as a beet. "I was acting in the best interest of the community," she attempted to explain. "No," I said from the rear, leaning forward with a smile. "You were doing the best for yourself." Some heads turned my way. I rose to my feet slowly, allowing the hush to fall before I continued speaking. "Margaret attempted to steal my property," I declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She believed she could bully me into relinquishing it, and when that did not succeed, she buried me in bureaucracy. But she was unsuccessful, and now she's merely attempting to cover up the mess she created." Margaret's mouth compressed into a thin line. "You don't even own property in this HOA, Monroe." "Oh, but I do," I responded with a smile. "You brought my property under your jurisdiction, so, by rights, I have a vote." There was a wave of shock across the room. The board members began to whisper among themselves, slowly comprehending what I'd just said. Margaret had been so focused on seizing my land, she'd given me the right to vote in her ouster by accident. A person finally put the vote to her. It wasn't even close either. Hands went up one by one in support of taking Margaret out of the presidency. The vote was heavily against her. Margaret slumped in her chair, as if she had been pulled out from under her feet. The very next day, I returned to my ranch, immersed in peacefulness and quietness, when a moving van arrived at Margaret's residence. I walked out onto my porch and sat there watching, slightly amused, as she paced back and forth, yelling orders at the movers. She had lost everything, her influence, her power, her reputation, and now she was departing. Almost I felt sorry for her. Almost. That night, I heard a knock on my door. A few of the HOA board members were there, a little nervous looking. One of them, a young man named Derek, awkwardly cleared his throat. "So, we've been discussing," he said, "and as Margaret's not around, we need someone new to step in." I furrowed my brow. "Let me stop you right there. If you're about to ask what I think you're about to ask, the answer is a big fat no." Derek raised his hands. "Just hear us out. We know the HOA's been a disaster lately. We need someone strong, someone who won't let the power go to their head." I crossed my arms. Still not interested. Then another board member, a woman in her 50s, stepped forward. "Jack," she told me, "if you ever make it president, you can vote to abolish the HOA." That stopped me in my tracks. "Repeat that," I asked. "If you become the leader," she replied, "you could shut it down altogether. No fees, no crazy regulations, people handling their own property, like it was meant to be from the very beginning." I hesitated for a long moment. Running an HOA was the last thing I wanted to do. But destroying it? That was something. I let out a huff. "Fine, I'll do it, but only if you agree to one condition." Derek nodded, like a puppy. "Name it." "I don't want to hear one peep of complaint when I incinerate every one of your HOA rulebooks." A week later, it was formal. The HOA was dissolved by unanimous approval. Homeowners were once and for all free to control their own property without supervision. No more fines for grass that was a hair too long. No more paint color restrictions. No more power-tripping nonsense. Just liberty. To mark the occasion, I hosted the largest barbecue the community had ever experienced. Smoked brisket wafted through the air. Beer ran freely. For the first time in years, folks were actually happy to reside here. As I stood at the grill, observing my neighbors laugh and socialize, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Satisfaction. Curtis arrived in the midst of the party, shaking his head in disbelief. "You really did it," he exclaimed, picking up a plate of ribs. "You demolished the HOA." I grinned. "Told you I'd fight dirty," he chuckled. "So, what are you going to do with all this newfound free time?" I looked out toward the horizon, where my newly strengthened fences loomed tall and unassailable. "Oh, I'll think of something." And with that, I toasted my beer, savoring a long, slow sip as the sun went down. My property was mine once more, and no one, no HOA, no bureaucrat, no living soul, was ever going to take it from me. I had won.